Dispense with the reading.
Without objection, so ordered.
Madam President, let me begin by applauding Senator Reid and Senator McConnell and all of those who are responsible for advancing this important ethics reform bill. There is no question but the confidence of the American people in the Congress is now at an almost all-time low. There is no question that there have been ethical abuses in Congress in recent years, and there is no question but that we should support the strongest ethics reform possible. Members of Congress do not need free lunches from lobbyists. Members of Congress do not need free tickets to ball games, and they do not need huge discounts for flights on corporate jets. Congress does need transparency in earmarks and holds, and we do need a new policy regarding the revolving door by which a member 1 year is writing a piece of legislation and the next year finds himself working for the company that benefit from the legislation that he or she wrote. In other words, Madam President, we need to pass the strongest ethics reform bill possible. But in passing this legislation, we need to understand that this is not the end of our work, but rather it is just the beginning, and much, much more needs to be done. Madam President, today in the United States of America, the middle class is shrinking, poverty is increasing, and the gap between the rich and the poor is growing wider. In fact, the people at the top, the very wealthiest people in our country, have never, ever had it so good since the 1920s. The sad truth is that Congress, especially over the last 6 years, has not only failed to respond to this crisis, to the decline of the middle class, but in many ways, Congress has made the situation even worse. Time and time again, this Congress has chosen to ignore the needs of ordinary Americans and instead has acted on behalf of the interests of the wealthiest and most powerful people in our country. In fact, Madam President, much of the legislation that has come to the floor of the House and the Senate in recent years has clearly come at the behests of multi-billion-dollar corporate interests. This has included a Medicare Part D prescription drug bill that, while costing the taxpayers of this country a huge amount of money, in fact provides a relatively weak benefit for our seniors. Included in this bill, as I think seniors all over this country are beginning to understand, is a very large donut hole in which they are going to have to pay 100% of the costs of their prescription drugs. And also included in that bill is language which prevents the government from negotiating with the drug companies for lower prices for the American people. We pay today the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs, and yet the government is prevented from negotiating for lower prices. Meanwhile, despite strong majority support in the House and the Senate, Congress has failed to pass legislation widely supported by the American people that would allow for the reimportation of safe, affordable prescription drugs from well-regulated countries like Canada and Europe, and that would provide huge discounts to Americans of all ages. At the same time, while there is more and more concern in our country and throughout the world about the danger of global warming and what it will mean for our planet and for our children and our grandchildren, Congress has failed to adequately fund energy efficiency and sustainable energy, but somehow, Congress did manage to fund an energy bill that includes billions and billions of dollars in tax giveaways and subsidies to the largest oil companies in America, companies that are enjoying record-breaking profits, as well as tax breaks and subsidies to other big energy interests. Mr. President, Madam President, most American workers now know that our current trade policies have failed and that they have failed miserably. During the last 5 years, we have lost some 3 million good-paying manufacturing jobs, and we are now on the cusp of losing millions of good-paying white-collar information technology jobs. In my own state of Vermont, not a major manufacturing center, we have lost 20% of our manufacturing jobs in the last 5 years alone. And we just learned the other day that another 175 jobs in Middlebury, Vermont, are going to be lost because of global competition. And yet, despite a $700 billion trade deficit and the loss of all millions of good-paying jobs, Congress refuses to fundamentally change our trade policies, a change that, in my view, is desperately needed. Madam President, I know that some people like to talk about quote-unquote special interests, but the truth is that special interests, as I understand them, in fact, are corporate and moneyed interests. What do we mean when we talk about special interests? Are we talking about millions of American working families that are struggling to keep their heads above water economically? Are they a quote-unquote special interest? I don't think that they are. Are we talking about the children of America, 18% of whom are living in poverty? Are they a quote-unquote special interest? Not to my mind. Are we talking about millions of seniors who want nothing more than to live out their retirement years with some form of economic security and dignity? Are they quote-unquote special interest? I don't believe that they are. The challenge that we face is to rein in the influence and the power that lobbyists and their large corporate clients have over the Congress. The problem is not that the children of America have too much power. It's not that working people have too much power. The power is that big money interests, to a very significant degree, dominate what goes on here in Washington, D.C. Now, the lobbying reform legislation that we are considering is a very important step forward in addressing that issue. And I want to thank Senator Reid, Senator Feinstein, Senator Lieberman, Senator Feingold, Senator Obama, and all of those on both sides of the aisle who have worked hard on this issue for their leadership on lobbying reform so that we can begin to restore the confidence of the American people in the U.S. Congress. But we must keep in mind that while we are eliminating the $20 lunches and the club-level tickets to local sporting events, this bill does not address what is an even more pressing issue, namely the $10,000 campaign contributions that come from corporate PACs. We have a fundamental problem which literally threatens our democratic form of government, and that is that senators and members of the House and their challengers are forced to raise millions and millions and millions of dollars in order to run a winning campaign. In terms of campaign contributions, let us be very clear. Despite what anyone may have heard, corporate interests are king. They run the show. From 1998 to 2005, for example, drug companies spent more on lobbying than any other industry, $900 million, according to the nonpartisan Center for Responsive Politics. They donated a total of $89.9 million in the same period to federal candidates and party committees. Now, we hear a lot about quote-unquote labor money and about quote-unquote big labor. But in fact, corporate interests give well more than 10 times as much to candidates than do labor unions. In the 2006 cycle, according to the Center for Responsive Politics, labor gave less than $50 million. That is a lot of money, $50 million. But corporate interest gave well over $525 million. 50 million, 525 million, 10 times as much. That disparity may well explain why the needs of working Americans all too often take a backseat to corporate interests in the Congress. But more importantly, that tells us why we need real campaign finance reform, so that the needs of all Americans are heard rather than just those who can afford to make these huge campaign contributions. To strengthen our democracy, we need reforms on a number of fronts. We certainly need to pass this lobbying reform bill, but we also need very strong campaign finance reform. My own view is that we need to move toward public funding of elections. We also need, Madam President, media reform to stem the growing concentration of ownership among television, radio, and newspaper companies, with the result that what Americans see, hear, and read is increasingly controlled by fewer and fewer media conglomerates. Most importantly, in my view, if we're going to change the balance of power, if ordinary Americans are going to get their day here in Washington, D.C., we need a revival of a grassroots democratic movement from one end of this country to the other, where ordinary people begin to stand up and say, Washington, D.C., pay attention to my needs rather than just the needs of large corporate interests. Now, I understand that the legislation before us today relates only to the issues around lobbying reform, and that many of the other critical issues I have laid out will be considered at a later time. And that is why I have offered the amendment we have before us today. This amendment will provide this body with some of the information it will need when we address campaign finance reform at a later date. Specifically, this amendment requires the Commission to strengthen confidence in Congress created by the underlying legislation, to report on the aggregate amount of campaign contributions given by certain identified corporate interests 24 months prior to and within 6 months after the passage of 4 specified pieces of legislation. These 4 pieces of legislation are the Medicare Part D program, the bankruptcy reform bill, the energy bill, and the Central American Free Trade Agreement. The goal of this report is to begin to throw some light on the volume of corporate contributions that are showered on Congress when legislation important to multinationals comes before the Congress. As a result, this report will focus on the amounts given and the identity of the givers. In closing, Madam President, let me just say that it is our obligation to return control of the Congress back to the American people. I look forward to helping make that happen with the ethics reform bill we are now considering and the many, many other equally critical reforms that voters across this great nation told us they wanted this past November. Thank you very much, Madam President.
Thank you, Senator.
Madam President.